Order, please. We'll now begin with the daily routine, beginning with presenting and reading of petitions. The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a petition with the operative clause. We, the undersigned citizens of Nova Scotia, are calling on the Government of Nova Scotia to take action on the current healthcare crisis. Mr. Speaker, it's signed by over 400 people that attended a rally in North Sydney last Saturday, and I've affixed my own name as per the rules of this House.
The petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
Mr. Speaker, joining us in the gallery today are Christine Hansen, the Chief Executive Officer of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, and Andre Kane, and I'd ask them to rise and receive the warm welcome of the House this morning.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to table the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission annual report.
The report is tabled. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Treaty Day in Nova Scotia, marked annually on October 1st, launches Mi'kmaq History Month in Nova Scotia. And whereas since 1986 we have come together with the Mi'kmaq to build upon our shared past so that we can create a better tomorrow for future generations. And whereas Treaty Day is a time to renew promises and an opportunity to celebrate the achievements of Mi'kmaq elders and youth, and a time for all Nova Scotians to learn and share the culture and heritage of the Mi'kmaq people. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the House of Assembly recognize the importance of Treaty Day in Nova Scotia, and through awareness and understanding, we will create an environment where reconciliation, respect, and friendship can be fostered. We are all treaty people. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. It is agreed. With all those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Orange Shirt Day started in 2013 after residential school survivor Phyllis Jack Wedstead shared her experience as a 6-year-old child arriving at a residential school for the first time and having her new orange shirt taken away from her. And whereas Orange Shirt Day is held on September 30th in Canadian schools and communities to bring awareness about the residential schools and for people to come together in the spirit of reconciliation and hope. And whereas the date was chosen because it is a time of year in which Indigenous children across Canada were taken from their homes to residential schools. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the House of Assembly and all Nova Scotians join students from across the province in recognizing Orange Shirt Day on September 30th. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. It is agreed. With all those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to draw the attention of members to the East Gallery, where I'd like to introduce a special guest, Barbara Steed Coyle, the Executive Officer for Muscular Dystrophy Canada. Please rise and receive the warm welcome of the House. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas muscular dystrophy is a group of neuromuscular disorders caused by a genetic mutation that weakens the body's muscles over time. And whereas causes, symptoms, age of onset, severity, and progression vary depending on an individual diagnosis. And whereas September is Muscular Dystrophy Awareness Month, a time to show support for those people affected by muscular dystrophy and related muscle diseases, therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge September as Muscular Dystrophy Awareness Month. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. With all those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
Mr. Speaker, I draw my colleagues' attention to the East Gallery, where we're joined today by Deputy Chief Daryl Beaton of Sheriff Services, and he's accompanied by two heroic deputy sheriffs who we're here to recognize today, Andrew Doan and Jen Pache, and I'd ask my colleagues to bring them a warm welcome from the House.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Deputy Sheriff Andrew Doan and Deputy Sheriff Jen Pache witnessed a single vehicle accident on September the 5th while transporting a youth from a court appearance, and whereas both immediately jumped into action calling for emergency response and assisting the driver and lone passenger out of the smoking vehicle and providing emergency first aid while awaiting the arrival of EHS and fire, and whereas Deputy Sheriffs Doan and Pache put themselves in harm's way and with their actions prevented further possible injury or loss of life, all while ensuring that the person in custody remains safe and secure. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join me in recognizing the bravery of Deputy Sheriff Andrew Doan and Deputy Sheriff Jen Pache and thank them for their quick response. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? Agreed. It is agreed. With all those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Monsieur le Président, à une date ultérieure, je demanderai l'adoption de la résolution suivante. Attendu que la loi sur les langues officielles est une loi fédérale qui est entrée en vigueur il y a 49 ans, en 1969, accordant aux Français et à l'anglais un statut égal au sein du gouvernement du Canada. Attendu que M. Raymond Théberge est le nouveau commissaire aux langues officielles et un champion de la promotion et de la préservation des langues françaises et anglaises dans la société canadienne, y compris dans les institutions fédérales et les communautés linguistiques minoritaires. Attendu qu'à titre de ministre des Affaires acadiennes et de la francophonie, j'ai eu le plaisir de rencontrer le commissaire hier matin pour discuter de l'importance de l'appui à nos communautés minoritaires de langue officielle et pour trouver des façons de faire en sorte que les services dont elles ont besoin sont offerts en français pour contribuer à leur croissance et à leur prospérité. Par conséquent, qu'il soit résolu que les membres de l'Assemblée législative se joignent à moi pour féliciter M. Raymond Théberge, le nouveau commissaire aux langues officielles du Canada. Monsieur le Président, je demande l'adoption de cette motion sans préavis et sans débat. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Official Languages Act, la loi sur les langues officielles, is a Canadian law that came into force 49 years ago, in 1969, which gives French and English equal status in the Government of Canada. And whereas Monsieur Raymond Théberge is the new Commissioner of Official Languages and a champion for promoting and preserving both English and French languages in Canadian society, including in federal institutions and in language minority communities. And whereas as Minister of Acadian Affairs and Francophonie, I had the distinct pleasure of meeting the Commissioner yesterday morning to discuss the importance of supporting our official language minority communities and to find ways to ensure that the services they need are available in French to help them grow and thrive. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly join me in congratulating M. Raymond Théberge as Canada's new Commissioner of Official Languages. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? Agreed. It is agreed. With all those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the aquaculture industry farm gate value doubled to over $116 million in 2017, creating employment and prosperity in our rural and coastal communities. Whereas the Aquaculture Association of Nova Scotia has represented aquaculture farmers and their suppliers for 4 decades. Whereas aquaculture produces quality shellfish and finfish in a cool, clean waters of Nova Scotia, creating a renewable resource and sustainable food supply for a rural maritime culture. Therefore, it be resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate the Aquaculture Association of Nova Scotia on their 40th anniversary of supporting the industry's sustainable growth. Mr. Speaker, I'd request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Acadian Affairs.
Monsieur le Président, à une date ultérieure, je demanderai l'adoption de la résolution suivante. Attendu que depuis sa création en 1968, la Fédération acadienne de la Nouvelle-Écosse a travaillé avec diligence pour promouvoir la vitalité et le développement de la communauté acadienne et francophone de la Nouvelle-Écosse. Attendu que la Fédération acadienne de la Nouvelle-Écosse a été la voix principale de la population acadienne et francophone et facilite les consultations et les partenariats entre ces organismes membres grâce à des services et à des programmes qui répondent aux besoins de la communauté acadienne. Attendu que la FAN poursuit son travail visant à promouvoir la culture dynamique et le riche patrimoine de la communauté acadienne auprès de tous les néo-écossais. Par conséquent, qu'il soit résolu que les membres de l'Assemblée législative se joignent à moi afin de féliciter la FAN pour ses 50 années de dévouement à la communauté acadienne et francophone de notre province. Monsieur le Président, je demande l'adoption de cette motion sans préavis et sans débat. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas since its creation in 1968, the Fédération Acadienne de la Nouvelle-Écosse has worked diligently to promote the vitality and development of Nova Scotia's Acadian and Francophone community. Whereas the Fédération Acadienne de la Nouvelle-Écosse has been the main voice of Nova Scotia's Acadian and Francophone population and works to facilitate consultation and partnership among its member organizations through services and programs that meet the needs of our Acadian community. Whereas La FAN continues its work in promoting the vibrant culture and rich heritage of our Acadian community with all Nova Scotians. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly join me in congratulating La Fédération Acadienne de la Nouvelle-Écosse on 50 years of dedication to our province's Acadian and Francophone community. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to draw the members' attention to the East Gallery, where I'd like to introduce 2 special guests. Susan Tilley-Russell is the Executive Director for the Arthritis Society Atlantic Region, and Joni Mitchell is the Director of Development for the Arthritis Society Atlantic Region. I'd ask the House to join me in giving them the warm welcome.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas arthritis is a chronic disease that affects more than 6 million Canadians, causing pain, swelling, and stiffness, and whereas the Arthritis Society promotes public awareness, provides help to those living with arthritis, and supports innovative research to help find a cure for this debilitating disease. And whereas September is Arthritis Awareness Month, a time to promote education and greater understanding of arthritis, therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize September as Arthritis Awareness Month. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolutions. resolution. Whereas when 2 apartment fires tragically took the life of a resident of Primrose Street in Dartmouth and displaced about 150 tenants earlier this year, the Canadian Red Cross and other emergency response volunteers worked to provide temporary shelter, clothing, food and other essentials to those displaced by the fire. And whereas I wish to thank the local councillor, Tony Mancini, the local member for Dartmouth North, and the Mayor, Mike Savage, for reaching out to the Department of Community Services, which manages the response to such emergencies through an agreement with the Canadian Red Cross. And whereas I wish to further thank the member for Dartmouth East, who together with the councillor organized moving vans for those who had been displaced, even though these fires did not occur in his riding. Therefore be it resolved, all members of this legislature recognize the valuable work of all those who stepped up to help those in need following the fires in Dartmouth North. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. We'll now move on to introduction of bills. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Prevention of Pressure Sores in Long-Term Care Facilities. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Prevention of Pressure Sores in Long-Term Care Facilities.
Bill number 71, entitled An Act Respecting the Prevention of Pressure Sores in Long-Term Care Facilities.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act, respecting the fixing of speed limits by traffic authorities of municipalities.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act, respecting the fixing of speed limits by traffic authorities of municipalities.
Bill number 72, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act, respecting the fixing of speed limits by traffic authorities of municipalities.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill and act to amend Chapter 211 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Housing Act, and Chapter 213 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Housing Nova Scotia Act.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 211 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Housing Act, and Chapter 213 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Housing Nova Scotia Act.
Bill number 73, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 211 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Housing Act, and Chapter 213 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Housing Nova Scotia Act.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act, respecting cyclists.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act, respecting cyclists.
Bill number 74, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act, respecting cyclists.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act, and Chapter 39 of the Acts of 2008, the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter, respecting inclusionary zoning.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act, and Chapter 39 of the Acts of 2008, the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter, respecting inclusionary zoning.
Bill number 75, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act, and Chapter 39 of the Acts of 2008, the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter, respecting inclusionary zoning.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Limit Increases in Rent for Residential Premises.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Limit Increases in Rent for Residential Premises.
Bill number 76, entitled An Act to Limit Increases in Rent for Residential Premises.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. We'll now move on to notices of motion. Statements by members. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the 19th annual Read by the Sea Festival took place in the village of River John in July. It was a weekend full of events which highlighted the importance of reading and literature. This festival is free to all to make sure everyone can participate. Some of the events included in the festival are a story walk with Mi'kmaq educator and author Gerard Gold, and another with the River John Historical Society. Another highlight was the Pitch the Publisher event, where hopeful authors pitched their writing projects. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank all the volunteers, participants, and attendees who made this event so successful. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers has long been one of the most active and progressive labour unions in Canada. Postal workers have worked hard to defend good union jobs in our community and have used the collective bargaining process to make gains for the entire working class, including their landmark strike in 1981, which resulted in the federal government creating universal maternity leave benefits for all Canadians. Today, postal workers are again on the verge of strike action, this time to demand that rural mail carriers, the majority of whom are women, receive equal pay for equal work. I ask that the members of this House of Assembly join me and my colleagues in the NDP caucus in supporting our postal workers and their campaign to defend good union jobs in our province and our country. Thank you.
The honourable member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to recognize Reverend Cheryl Rafuse of St. Paul's Anglican Church for the service provided in the annual blessing of the boat ceremony at the SS Atlantic Heritage Park. Almost completely surrounded by water, Nova Scotia has a rich history with the sea and is well known for its high tides. Unfortunately, the high tides are not always kind and claim the lives of all passengers aboard the SS Atlantic when it sank off the coast of Terrence Bay in 1873. To honour those who lost their lives on the SS Atlantic when the vessel sank, St. Paul's Church in Terrence Bay hosted a multi-denominational service to bless the local fishing boats and recreational boats. The service has been an annual event for 35 years. At this year's event, Cheryl's grandson, Logan Henderson, also contributed with a reading. I would ask the members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly to join me in congratulating Reverend Cheryl Rafuse, Anglican Congregation of St. Paul's Church, for hosting this important event. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the West Gallery, we have Leo McKenzie and John Brownlow, councillors from the Better Together organization. With them are Mark Decker, Luke Elwood, and Brent Kerr, who reside at the Hilton Drive Group Home in Dartmouth East. We also have Kathleen McMillan from Rosewood Group Home, and we have Chelsea Leroy, a former student of mine at Prince Andrew High School and a Special Olympian. Mr. Speaker, I ask our guests to please stand and receive the warm welcome of the House of Assembly.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize the extraordinary work being accomplished by the Better Together Group Home, located in Dartmouth East. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, there are amazing volunteers at Better Together who have such passion for helping others. From volunteering at Margaret's House to tending the garden at St. Vincent de Paul Parish, to Earth Day community cleanups, to volunteering at the Terry Fox Run, Better Together reminds us of the importance of giving back to your community. Mr. Speaker, our province is a better place because of Mark Deckert, Brent Kerr, Luke Elwood, and Chelsea Leroy. Along with their councillors, Leo McKenzie and John Brownlow, their desire to help others is an inspiration. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members of this House to recognize the outstanding work being done to help others by the Better Together group home. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to bring the success of Jacob Ring's culinary career to the attention of the House. The 23-year-old chef who hails from Lower Sackville is currently working at Fleur de Sal in Lunenburg, has won the prestigious Concours Culinaire competition, an international achievement rarely bestowed on someone so young. A graduate of the NSCC Akerley campus, Jacob will travel to Paris in May to be the first Canadian ever inducted into the French Toque Blanche Society, Mr. Speaker. He's already receiving job offers in Europe, and since winning this two-day competition over the weekend, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to following the career trajectory of Jacob Brand, who has made Lower Sackville very proud. I ask the House to join me in congratulating him on his success and the successes yet to come, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sydney Whitney Pier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to recognize a great community leader and no stranger to this House, David Wilton of New Waterford. Mr. Speaker, David Wilton is a tireless community advocate. He's a former MLA, and he has advocated for millions of dollars of infrastructure in his community. We've learned today that David was responsible for a new skateboard park in New Waterford, and he's been advocating for millions of dollars of infrastructure improvements in schools and healthcare and community organizations across the community. So, Mr. Speaker, I rise in my place today to congratulate Dave on his hard work for the new skateboard park for the kids in the community, and congratulate him on his successful businesses and his community leadership. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize 4-H members from across this province who will gather in Bridgewater this weekend for the 41st 4-H Nova Scotia Pro Show. It's the largest 4-H show in Canada. There are almost 2,400 members, 900 leaders, and 100 4-H clubs in Nova Scotia. It's an organization dedicated to young people with the motto of learn by doing. 4-H members work all year to earn their spot to compete at this show. Over 40 projects, 90 classes, more than 24 entries will be displayed throughout the weekend. The weekend will include livestock auctions, dog obedience and handling trails, showmanship classes, young speakers for agriculture, and much more. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank and congratulate everyone involved in organizing 4-H Pro Show this weekend and wish all participants the best of luck. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate the honorees at the recently held Waverley Legion Awards and Honour Night. My wife and I were honoured to attend the annual dinner, which acknowledged and thanked the members of service and volunteering their time. Special awards were given to Diane Moore and Mildred Casey for 55 years of membership to the Ladies Auxiliary. Sheila Pickram for membership and Legionnaire of the Year, and Gerald Burgess, second vice, and Cheryl Sinnett received the Appreciation Award. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members of the legislature, Nova Scotia Legislature, and I have affixed my name to join me in thanking and congratulating all award winners and volunteers for their dedication and the work they do on behalf of Dieppe 90 Waverley Legion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for many years, the volunteers of the Bulliedry Mammal Warriors has made our community proud of their hard work and fundraising efforts to assist the Cancer Patient Care Fund and training for the annual Dragon Boat Festival. A dedicated team that is comprised of women and men of Bulliedry Island who have volunteered together for 11 years and have raised over $200,000. After fundraising all year, the team was led to their boat on August 11th by bagpipes playing Scotland the Brave for the 9:30 race on the Sydney waterfront. The first race landed them a three-way tie for first, and they finished fourth in the second race. The team was the top fundraising team this year, raising $30,057, well over half the total of money raised during the festival. I'd like all members of this legislature to join me in congratulating the Bullittry Mammal Warriors team for their outstanding fundraising accomplishment and thank them for their dedication to the Cancer Patient Care Fund. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to recognize Ann Patrick, who recently retired as the chair of the St. Margaret's Bay Area Rails to Trails Association. During her 3-year tenure as chair, Ann and her team performed a total upgrade of the entire trail from Hubley to Hubbards that featured a new connection to the Jerry Lawrence Provincial Park, upgrades to several bridges, resurfacing much of the trail, and removing excess overgrowth of trees and shrubs. To give a measure of her effectiveness, Ann is being replaced by 2 co-chairs. Fortunately, Ann will stay on the board as past chair. The association itself underwent a restructuring with securing new volunteers, obtaining financial grants, and becoming part of the renowned Rum Runners Trail Association in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I would like the members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly to join me in congratulating Ann for the great work she accomplished with the St. Margaret's Bay Rails to Trails Association and to wish her well in her future endeavours. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I would like to recognize 2 constituents, Nick Baumauer and Riley Felix, for making the United or Under-18 football Nova Scotia team. The Under-18 Tackle Canada Football Cup tournament was hosted in Calgary this year and Nova Scotia last year. The team players gained experience from playing other teams from across the country. The players also gained exposure from scouting groups from across the country as well. Nick Baumauer and Riley Felix play high school football at Auburn High School. They both look forward to playing football at the university level. Riley was just recently selected to the 2018 Under-18 Team Canada All-Star Team. I ask all members of the Nova Scotia Legislature to join me in congratulating Nick Baumauer and Riley Felix. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, on February 7, 2018, the House of Commons passed a motion declaring today, September 28th, National British Home Child Day. From 1869 to 1948, over 100,000 British boys and girls were brought to Canada as child immigrants and indentured labourers. Many of those children were from orphanages, but some were also from families that had fallen on hard time and were sent to Canada with a promise for a better life. It is estimated that approximately 4 million Canadian descendants are from the British Home Children movement. One of these descendants is Joyce Martell. Joyce's father was brought to Canada to work on a farm. Joyce said her father managed to build a good life in Canada and was fortunate that he was taken in by a good family. Not all of the home children were so lucky. Many had a life of hardship and abuse that they could not escape until they were 18. Mr. Speaker, this day of recognition is so important to the descendants of the home child. Like Joyce Martell, the young children were taken from their country and sometimes their family and were brought to a strange land where they are often overworked and not cared for. Joyce, along with many descendants of the home children, are pleased that the National British Home Children Day was declared, finally bringing attention to part of our history that is seldomly recognized. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge the 4th annual Caleb Superhero Walk, which is being held on Sunday, September the 30th at Petersfield in Point Edward. Caleb's walk was inspired by a 3-year-old Caleb. It was created by his mom to commemorate him and all the amazing little cancer warriors who battled yesterday, who are battling today, and who will battle tomorrow. Caleb lost his battle on March the 24th, 2015. Caleb's parents, Nicole and Mike, now help other sick children in Cape Breton and have renovated the pediatrics room in a superhero theme to honor their little boy. Caleb's Courage is now working on an endowment fund in Caleb's name to help children for many years to come. I am humbled to thank Nicole and Mike for their commitment to help make life a bit easier for other families who face these tragedies far too often. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Lunenburg.
Speaker, I rise today to congratulate Emily Latta of Oak Hill on her recent accomplishments at the Special Olympics Canada 2018 Summer Games. Emily competed in the Special Olympics held in Antigonish from July 31st to August 4th and brought home 3 medals. Emily received a gold in shot put, a silver in the 100-meter, and a gold in the 4x100-meter relay. Cody Latta, Emily's father and chosen coach for Team Nova Scotia, said that he was very proud of all the members from Lunenburg Queens who had an exceptional showing, as well as all the athletes of the provincial team. Mr. Speaker, I would ask that you and all members of this House of Assembly please join me in congratulating Emily Latta on her success at the 2018 Special Olympic Games. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge the huge volunteer contributions of Margot Zwicker from Mill Village in Queens County. Earlier this year, the monthly Queens Crime Prevention Breakfast, which had started back in 1991, had to cease because this stalwart volunteer was unable to continue and her shoes were simply too big to fill. Over the years, she has and still does donate her skills and time to many not-for-profit groups, including the Seniors Activity Group, whose membership has grown to 60-plus members with Margot at the helm. Mr. Speaker, I would like to honour Margot for all her community work and thank her for her years of volunteer service on behalf of the many groups who have benefited. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Clayton Park West.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognise a pharmacist in my riding who's creating new and efficient practices in the industry. Robin Ogilvie has managed a Guardian Rockingham pharmacy on Farnham Gate Road since 2011. He is known to go far beyond his duties to help his patients. This October, Robin will be awarded the Top Pharmacist of the Year presented by the Pharmacy Association of Nova Scotia Conference and Gala. Robin graduated from Dalhousie's pharmacy program in 2008, yet still donates his time and talents by mentoring the future generation of pharmacists. Robin also helps coordinate the operations of 8 other Guardian pharmacies, expanding from Shubenacadie to Spryfield. He is currently working on many projects, such as the coagulation testing pilot and the collaborative care with Dr. Mishra. Mr. Speaker, I would, with this House of Assembly, join me in congratulating Mr. Ogilvie on his remarkable achievements, and thank you, Robin.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to salute Stuart Lafort. Stuart is a Westmount resident who heroically tried to save the life of his neighbour who had suffered a heart attack. He kept his neighbour alive until paramedics arrived. Because of his extraordinary efforts, Stuart was awarded the St. John Ambulance Life-Saving Award. These awards recognize individuals who have administered first aid while saving or attempting to save a life. I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate Stuart for receiving this important award and thank all St. John Ambulance volunteers for their service to our communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for King South.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize robotics team Robust Legacy, representing Horton High School in Greenwich. Earlier this year, Team Robust Legacy completed and finished second at RoboFest, Acadia's robotic programming competition hosted by the Jodrey School of Computer Science. Teams were challenged to build and program their robots using imagination alongside computer, logic, mathematics, and engineering skills. Their second-place finish qualified them this past May to compete at the RoboFest World Championship at Lawrence Tech University in Southfield, Michigan. Robust Legacy team members Aidan Karcha, Austin Oikel, Ethan Bullerwell, and Lex Zacharias attended the event along with their coach Andy Pitter and mentor Jeannie Caldwell. I would like the members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly to join me in congratulating the members of Robust Legacy on representing Nova Scotia at the 2018 RoboFest World Championships. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce to my colleagues here in the House and who are sitting in the Speaker's gallery, and I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for accommodating my mom today to be able to sit there. My mother, my beautiful, beautiful mother, who has come all the way from Cape Breton early this morning with my fiancé, Chuck Boudreau, Marie Elizabeth Pon, who is a lifelong resident of Isle Madame, strong, beautiful, and always there for me and always reminding me to try to be my best and to stay true to myself. Welcome you to the House today.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, one of life's most precious gifts is being a mother. My mother, Marie, has tirelessly dedicated her entire life to the well-being of her children. Mr. Speaker, my father worked away in Ontario most of our lives. My mother is like so many other women who for generations in Nova Scotia continue to be faced with husbands working away in order for their families to thrive. These mothers take the responsibility of raising children on their own, and in my mother's case, there were 5 of us, spirited and sometimes a handful. Mr. Speaker, my family is from a tightly knit rural community in Cape Breton. We love, are respectful, and compassionate to one another in our moments of greatest need. These are core values that were taught to me by my mother and my father. I would like to thank my mother and my father for these gifts that last long past death, and if valued and nurtured, carry on, as they will in my family, for generations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize Yarmouth County's Virginia Smith, or as she is more affectionately known in Yarmouth as Ginny. After nearly 5 decades of coaching the Yarmouth Y Whitecaps swim team, Ginny has put away her stopwatch and retired. Ginny spent over 45 years volunteering her time and energy to the Whitecaps, both of the Yarmouth YMCA pool deck, and traveling with her Whitecap swimmers as they practiced and competed throughout the province and country. Ginny is a highly respected and revered coach throughout the Canadian swim community. She has been described by her former swimmers and colleagues as an individual whose selflessness is unparalleled, who has touched thousands of lives, is a wealth of knowledge, and who is irreplaceable in every sense of the word. I ask this House to join me in wishing Ginny Smith a happy and healthy retirement, and in thanking her for her 45 years of wisdom, support, and friendship to countless Yarmouth Y Whitecap swimmers and their families, both in and out of the pool. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, I stand today to recognize Bill Digdon, Peter Rushton, and Mike Johnson for organizing the 4th annual Bordertown Biker Bash in Amherst, June 13th to 15th. The Biker Bash includes a long list of events, including the Burnout Competition, the Hub City Stunt Riders, and the high-flying acrobatics from the Pure Adrenaline Stunt Riders. This year was the most successful bike bash yet, and the highest turnout and most enthusiastic community support. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to thank the organizers of the Bordertown Biker Bash for putting on another successful event, and I wish them well as they begin planning next year's bash. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Al McMullen retired in July after serving 35 years with the province as a public health inspector. Born in Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, Al moved to Lunenburg County to work with the Department of Health in 1983, and over the duration of his career has also worked with the Department of Environment, Department of Agriculture, and back to Department of Environment. Al enjoyed working in Lunenburg County his entire career, but also appreciated the opportunity to travel province-wide as a go-to guy for his knowledge and expertise in public health enforcement, management, inspection, and education. Al is a people person. He's outgoing, engaging personality made it easy for him to relate to all people, and says that the best part of his job was getting out and about and working with the public on a day-to-day basis. Al was also fortunate to be involved with the development of the province's regulations, guidelines, policies, programs concerning public health. Al won't be slowing down too much in retirement. He plans to continue educating people about food safety, volunteering with the RCMP Auxiliary and the YMCA Board of Directors. Congratulations and best wishes to Al McMullen on his retirement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the baseball bar has been set high in Spring Hill by the Stone brothers. 17-year-old twin brothers Matt and Nate Stone have each won 5 AAA minor league baseball titles in 5 years, 3 provincial titles, 1 Atlantic title, and 1 national elimination title that captured them the chance to go to the 2018 National Championships in Fort McMurray this year. Nate placed shortstop and second base, while Matt plays catcher and third base. Both of the boys have been thankful to their coaches who have taught and supported them throughout the years. Now at their end of the minor baseball career, both brothers hope to continue playing in Truro next year. But once a Spring Hill fence buster, always a Spring Hill fence buster. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in congratulating Matt and Nate Stone on the outstanding achievements in their baseball career and wish them the very best of luck in the future. Thank you.
The honourable member for Bedford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to wish a special Bedford resident a happy birthday in advance of his celebration tomorrow. Lou Turner is well known in Bedford. He's an active volunteer, especially with the Fort Sackville Foundation and Scott Manor House. He's up early each morning taking stunning photographs of nature. You can see them on Facebook, which Lou joined fairly recently. Lou is one of those people that you look forward to seeing at events. He's kind and smart and thoughtful, and I want to wish him a happy 90th birthday and a terrific decade ahead.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, I was lucky to attend a speech by Senator Murray Sinclair earlier this month, hosted by Dalhousie University as part of its 200th anniversary celebrations. Today, on Orange Shirt Day, I want to thank Senator Sinclair for his generosity and clear thought as he shared with a full theatre how we can move forward with reconciliation. Reconciliation requires that we first accept and sit with the painful truth of how our beloved country was founded and in some ways continues as a colonial project. Today, we remember how that played out in the lives of children taken from their families and communities, punished for their language, separated from their culture. Today, we witness the struggle and resilience of Indigenous people across Turtle Island and can offer allyship as we are all treaty people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From August 1 to August 4, 79 junior members from across Canada participated in the Canadian Junior Limousine Impact Show at Ballamore Farm, located in Great Village, Colchester North. The juniors were accompanied by 97 limousine cattle. Large tents were erected at the Ballamore Farm to host the juniors, as well as the 300-plus people involved in watching or participating over the 4 days of fun, competition, showmanship, and Nova Scotia hospitality. The juniors had a chance to learn about various aspects of life on the East Coast, including clam digging, watching the fishermen gather from the weir, picking strawberries, and enjoying bonfires, competitions in judging, oral marketing, and fitting a heifer in 20 minutes. The weekend finished with a banquet and fireworks on the beach, typical of East Coast. Many volunteers worked to make the weekend a huge success, but special thanks and congratulations belong to Carolyn and Joe Cooper, the owners of Ballamore Farm.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the gallery behind me, I'd like to introduce my beautiful daughter. Mr. Speaker, she takes a keen interest in politics, watches question period regularly. When she's not studying to be a doctor in this province, she's here today to observe question period, to see some of the answers, and hopefully someday she'd like to be part of the solution, Mr. Speaker, her with her other international merit graduates. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I would like to recognize 2 Eastern Passage Pirates midget baseball players, Donovan Surratt Lombard and Sydney Brimacombe. Both Donovan and Sydney will be aging out of minor baseball this year. Their countless hours as volunteer workers for the Eastern Passage Minor Baseball Association over the years has not gone unnoticed. They are well known for using their free time to help with the opening day along with other tournaments, bottle drives, and winter ball camps, just to mention a few of the things that they do for us. It is bittersweet to have to say goodbye to such a great role models in our community and their association. I ask all members to join me in thanking Donovan and Sydney for all of their hard work and kind efforts, and to wish them well in their future endeavours. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
Thank you. In the gallery opposite, I introduce my constituent and friend, Kendall Worth. Kendall is a frequent correspondent of many members. Anyone who has served on the Community Services Committee would know that he frequently shares his experience as a single adult living with disabilities and dependent on income assistance. So thank you very much, Kendall, for gracing us with your presence today.
The honourable member for Antigonish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On September 7th, 1976, Joseph Corey and his family, including his mother, his father, and 4 siblings, arrived in Canada from Lebanon. Joseph was 11 years old. During Lebanon's civil war, their home in Beirut was occupied and they were forced to run. For 2 years, they were internally displaced refugees and were constantly moving from one friend or cousin to another. They left Lebanon and landed in Mirabel, Quebec, with just a few dollars and only able to speak Arabic. They made their home in Ottawa, where his aunt and her family had previously settled. Joseph lived in Ottawa until 2004, when he moved to Antigonish, accepting a teaching position at St. FX University. Today, Dr. Corey is a professor at St. FX who is a well-known Renaissance scholar specializing in Shakespeare, an author, and an active volunteer in the community. Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to pay tribute to Joseph and his family and recognize the recent anniversary of 42 years in Canada.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
I'd like to introduce my husband here today of 27 years, Dr. Murray McCrossan, and thank him for all of his love and undying support.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, anyone that is a parent knows nothing can compare to the love of your child. So today, Mr. Speaker, I rise to wish my daughter, Kelsey, who lives in Northwest Territories, a very happy 30th birthday. Kelsey is a beautiful, strong, independent, compassionate woman, and she's an amazing mother to my grandson. I am so proud of her accomplishments and how brave she is, traveling the many communities of the Northwest Territories with her husband, who is with the RCMP. I ask all members to join me in wishing my beautiful Kelsey Robar a very happy birthday today.
The honourable member for Clare Digby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to welcome Constable Frederick Mubiru into our area. As elsewhere in our province, we want to make our communities their new home. They may arrive as strangers, but quickly become our friends and part of our community. Constable Mubiru grew up a long way from Digby, growing up in Uganda and arriving in Canada 10 years ago as a refugee. For Frederick, becoming a police officer was only a distant dream until he immigrated to Canada. Then he was determined to become an RCMP officer. He returned to school, became an associate professor in a church, and organized an association to support youth and immigrants. He was accepted at the RCMP Academy and graduated at the top of his class, receiving the highest score in applied police services. He also became the first person
Time allotted for members' statements has expired. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Today is the last day of Right to Know Week. I'll bet the Premier and many others will be counting down the hours to the end of today. Yesterday, Canada's privacy watchdog said there is an urgent need for stronger laws to protect personal information. Privacy Commissioner Daniel Theron said, and I quote, and will table, "Respect for those laws must be enforced by a regulator independent from industry and independent from government, with sufficient powers to ensure their compliance." When it comes to privacy laws, Mr. Speaker, the Premier disagrees with all the experts. Why does the Premier refuse to give our Privacy Commissioner the independence and authority everybody but his government agrees she needs to have to do her job?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, the privacy officer makes a number of recommendations across to our government. We continue to accept those and implement the changes, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to work with her to ensure that the information she's looking for is out there, at the same time protecting the information of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, that is their private information.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the disrespect the Premier has shown for transparency in Nova Scotia is astounding. It's disrespect for the Commissioner, and he has gone out of his way to correct me, actually, and other members when we refer to Ms. Tolley as the Privacy Commissioner or the Information and Privacy Commissioner, which is the correct title for her. The annual reports from Mrs. Tolley's office for 2016-17 clearly refer to the office as that of the Information and Privacy Commissioner, not officer. The website refers to the Information and Privacy Commissioner. Why does the Premier use every opportunity to diminish the importance of the office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner for Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the office, Mr. Speaker, the information officer in this province continues to do her work. We'll continue to comply, Mr. Speaker, when FOIA pops come in. We continue to respond to those. Mr. Speaker, over 82% of those are done in 30 days, the highest recorded in the province, Mr. Speaker. We continue to make sure that we improve that. We have an open data portal, Mr. Speaker. We continue to improve that. We put Cabinet Minister, Executive Council's expenses online for all Nova Scotians to see them, Mr. Speaker. We continue to make sure, and we'll continue to work, that we continue to open up the process for the information that is available to be shared with Nova Scotians. We will continue to share it.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the contempt this government feels for Nova Scotians has become obvious in the past few weeks in this legislature. Last week, he called his 2013 promise to expand the powers and mandate of the FOIPOP Commissioner a mistake. That didn't mean anything because it wasn't in his platform. He defended his deputy's refusal to allow an EA to talk to the Privacy Commissioner about a secret email address. His government has attempted to drastically reshape the Public Accounts Committee to avoid scrutiny. Will the Premier admit that he will use every manoeuvre possible to avoid embarrassing scrutiny and real transparency for Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. If she goes back and looks at the FOIPOP that was submitted by a reporter, Mr. Speaker, she asked for the email addresses in a certain period of time. All of those were turned over to the applicant who asked for that information. Mr. Speaker, that's open and transparent. They had that information. When it comes to the Public Accounts Committee, Mr. Speaker, we've actually put in front of it the Auditor General. I'm not sure why the opposition would actually be the ones to set the agenda instead of letting the Auditor General set the agenda. They talk about independence from government, Mr. Speaker. He clearly is independent from us. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we responded to the request of opposition parties to create a new committee, Mr. Speaker, on health. Mr. Speaker, how much more open and transparent can you be, Mr. Speaker, than to allow an independent person to set what sits on the record in public accounts and allow the largest budget item to be scrutinized in its own department? Shame on that party, Mr. Speaker, for open and be fighting against open and transparency.
The Honourable Leader of the Official New Democratic Party.
According to a news report published yesterday, which I'll table, the monitoring and reporting of bed sores mandated by the government in June in response to deaths in long-term care has been a short-lived program. The government is no longer requiring the mandatory reporting of stage 1 and stage 2 bed sores. Can the Premier explain why this reporting requirement was discontinued at just the time when we're needing more, not less, information about long-term care in order to address the crisis there?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are a number of categories he's referring to. Mr. Speaker, we asked an independent expert to go out and do an analysis. They were into homes working with their partners, our partners, to be able to ensure that we have the appropriate recording of bed sores in the region, Mr. Speaker, in the province. They put out protocols on how we should report those. She is also part of our panel that is out looking at long-term care, which will be reporting back in the end of November, and I look forward to hearing the recommendations that they bring forward.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
This same news report on nursing home bed sores speaks about, and I'll quote, it speaks about efforts to obtain information on the number of bed sores being, quote, hampered by secrecy. It speaks also about having to file freedom of information requests in order to receive information about nursing homes that in the majority of the rest of the country, information that is available, in fact, online. So I want to ask the Premier to explain what possible purpose is being served by secrecy about nursing homes.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the questions. You know, Mr. Speaker, we had an expert go out to work with our partners to deal with this very challenging issue. We'll continue to work with them, the guidelines associated around how do we deal and report relationship when it comes to bed sores. I'm also looking at, as he would know, the committee that is out there looking at long-term care will bring back recommendations, Mr. Speaker. We asked them to come back by November 30th. That allows us to take those recommendations, review them, and put them in the budget process. We continue to make investments in ensuring that we can deal and allow that we're providing people with the appropriate care. Make sure that we continue to invest not only in long-term care, as we've done in Kilbretton Island with an extra 50 beds, but continue to invest in home care. Many Nova Scotians are telling us they want to continue to live at home as long as possible, and we'll continue to strike that balance.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
The Canadian Institute on Health Information gathers and receives information on a range of incidents in nursing homes, falls and incidents of over-medication, also incidents of bed sores. And in a majority of provinces of Canada, this is something that is done by every nursing home in the entire province. But in our province, the total number of nursing homes that are providing this information to the Institute on Health Information is 1. And so I want to ask the Premier to explain, if we're looking and hoping to improve the quality of care in nursing homes, why is the government not gathering as much data as we can possibly get our hands on in order to address what needs to be improved?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That is exactly, Mr. Speaker, what was happening. It's why we hired an expert in this very issue, Mr. Speaker, to send them into the long-term care facilities to identify why the reporting wasn't happening, why in some cases it was being reported differently, why some bed sores were being ranked differently than others, to make sure that the process was being done properly. And it's why they are part of the committee that is looking at what are the other issues associated with ensuring that we can continue to improve the care that we provide in our long-term care facilities across the province.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rose in question period yesterday on a question about the 2017-2018 FOIPOP annual report and the complete omission of the FOIPOP portal breach in that report. The minister's response from yesterday was that the breach didn't occur in the reporting period, and I found that response a little vexing. So fact 1, by the department's own admission and verified by police, the breach occurred between March 3rd and March 5th of 2018. Fact 2, the report covers the fiscal year from April 1st, 2017 to March 31st, 2018. And fact 3, March 3rd, 4th, and 5th, 2018 all occur before March 31st, 2018. In order for the minister's response to be accurate, one of these facts must be incorrect. Could the minister identify which one is the erroneous fact?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I explained to the member yesterday, the activity of the breach took place outside of last year's fiscal period. So it would not be captured in last year's fiscal report, annual report. And also, as I encourage the member to listen to this, and all members, we have been actively engaged with 2 independent bodies who will look at this issue of the breach, a breach that we take very seriously, and make sure that the proper procedures and follow-throughs take place based on those 2 independent reports.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I will table a calendar for March 2018, which does show that those dates come before March 31st, 2018, so we can table that. Mr. Speaker, this breach the government has chosen not to report the FOIPOP breach, which clearly demonstrates and that it occurred within the reporting period. If the breach was detected after the report was published, I could understand the omission, but the breach has been known for about 6 months, and I believe the government is intentionally choosing an interpretation that allows the government to put as much distance as possible between the breach and their obligation to report on it. And I think this interpretation pushes the boundaries of department's obligation to report. Will the minister retract the report and publish a new one that accurately reports the offence of 2017-18?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And while I appreciate the member's question and his ability to try and teach me how the dates of the month work, I would like to inform him and inform all members that I am putting my trust in the 2 independent reports in regards to this breach, even if that member chooses to disregard them.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Finance. Yesterday, we received a budget update from the Minister and the government. As we all know, there are many factors that can cause budgets to change. The risk currently being watched by the department includes high levels of household debt and related low levels of household spending. I guess average Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, are still waiting for all that economic prosperity to trickle down, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Minister, can the Minister tell us how the government plans to address the serious issue, Mr. Speaker, of household debt facing many families here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. I would suggest that every member of this House has a concern, a legitimate concern about the ability and our desire to have every Nova Scotian be able to provide for themselves and their families. Our government has demonstrated through a number of different departments our initiatives to try to do that and to try to put more money in the hands of all Nova Scotians, and in particular low-income Nova Scotians who are struggling in some cases to provide for themselves and their families. And some of those programs, as the member would know, would be from finance, some would be from community services, some would be from Service Nova Scotia, and some would be from education. So it certainly is something that we as a government recognize and have taken some initial steps and will continue to take those steps to help those in need.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In keeping with this government's claimed desire to be open and transparent, the budget update included a $36 million appropriation for non-wage corporate initiatives. When pressed about exactly what that meant, Mr. Speaker, department staff explained that it was government's commitment and initiatives that were yet to be announced. So, Mr. Speaker, since it is the final day of Right to Know Week, doesn't the minister think Nova Scotians have the right to know what government is doing with the $36 million of public funding?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to the member opposite, I would suggest that he may want to hearken back. From the mid-90s on, there has been a line in the budget for restructuring, and we will continue to make sure that we have funds available in a restructuring account so that if and when there is a project that we want to introduce and it has been fully detailed, when that is complete, it will be announced as soon as it is ready, and that member will know as soon as I do. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of TIR. The West Middle River Road was trying to reclaim its fame as one of the worst roads in Atlantic Canada. Years of neglect and band-aid solutions have many constituents calling my office wondering when the Minister's Department will finally do the necessary repairs to ensure that the road is properly maintained. They were happy when it was announced that some new blacktop would be laid on the road. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, during the project, the culvert has been washed out, and residents now have to endure a 15 to 20-minute detour while the work takes place. So my question to the Minister, how did pre-work inspection on West Middle River Road miss the compromised condition of the culvert?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. I'm very pleased to say that, yes, we are doing some significant work in that area, and we do have a slope failure which occur regularly across the province. Are dependent, of course, on weather events. particularly heavy rainfalls, and on coastal areas erosion, and we've certainly taken that into consideration in this instance. Thank you.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, residents are concerned that this work won't be properly completed because they had asked for that culvert to be replaced before. They're concerned that recent paving going on this is just lipstick. I would like to see a total reclamation of this road to ensure crews will be back in 2 years' time. Winter is approaching and the residents don't want to be facing this detour in the snow because the roads are not ploughed on a regular basis. So my question to the Minister, will he provide the scope and timeline of this very important project for my constituents?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank the member opposite for the question, Mr. Speaker. And yes, former governments had said they're going to do things. This government is doing things. That's right. We're doing things with our road system, and I'm very, very happy to report to the member and to the good people of Middle River that the culvert will be replaced. It will be replaced before the snow flies. We're currently looking for an emergency permit from the Department of Environment to work in the waterway, and we're going to take care of that problem like other governments didn't.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Lands and Forests. Mulberry Beach is a real crown jewel of the Northumberland Strait. It's a very popular tourist and local destination in the summertime. It's just a beautiful beach. It was on the front of the Doers and Dreamers guide at one time, Mr. Speaker. The website claims that there's drinking water at the beach, but often there are signs posted that warn people not to drink the water. My question for the Minister, is the Minister aware of the drinking water problems at Mulberry Beach, and can he speak to the root cause of the problem and the go-forward plan?
The Honourable Minister of Lands and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for the question. To my knowledge, I don't have that information about the water issues there. It is one of the most popular beaches across the province, which is why the department provides many amenities there that not all beaches have. We have lifeguard services there all summer long. We have amenities such as the washroom facilities, ample parking, and I will look forward to seeing what the reports are in terms of the water, and I'll see if we can remedy that. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A former Minister of Natural Resources offered to go for a walk on the beach with my colleague from Pictou Centre. Maybe the current minister will as well. But the beach is a fantastic destination. But the drinking water issue has underscored a different problem, and that issue is there's no food services at the beach. There's nothing really nearby for families and other visitors. To get a bite to eat or a splash to quench the thirst requires a long drive. So over the years, there have been attempts to bring services to the beach. My question for the minister is, what opportunities is the minister looking at, or will the minister consider to bring food services back to Mulberry Beach?
The Honourable Minister of Lands and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, I already did commit to his colleague, the member for Pictou Centre, to take that walk along the beach, but I'd be happy to join the other member as well. It is an important beach, and in terms of availability for food vendors, there was one last year for the summer season in 2017. Unfortunately, that food vendor did not reapply for this year. But when we put out our tenders this winter for more food services, we hope that there will be someone bidding on that project. I encourage both members, all members from Pictou, to engage their network if they know vendors that are interested in providing that service, to get them to bid on that tender. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation. During the spring session, my colleague from Pictou East and myself questioned the Minister about the junction of the Abercrombie Road and the Trenton Connector in Pictou County and how dangerous this intersection is, and all too often the scene of many and unfortunately fatal accidents. We asked the Minister if his department was considering a roundabout, and the Minister's answer, and I quote, "We did brush cutting in that intersection. We put new signage in, and we will consider looking at that for future improvements," and I can table that. So my question is, can the Minister provide an update regarding further improvements?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. And we are reviewing that particular intersection, as we are in many other instances where we see that the evolution in traffic patterns has resulted in different requirements. That intersection is particularly unique because there's quite a bit of industrial traffic that goes through there, and I believe there has been a recent traffic study done on that, and I'll endeavour to find out where that's at.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
I think the study was done in 2015. During spring estimates, the Minister agreed to meet me in Pictou County to review the Trenton Connector, the Pictou Rotary, and the Westville Road. We were going to spend the day together. In fact, he indicated we should meet before the end of June. The Minister requested I write a formal letter, though, to invite him. So I wrote a letter April 9th, and I'll table that letter, but I had no reply back. I followed up with another letter June 1st and had no reply back. Mr. Speaker, the pain of rejection is overwhelming. So, I just want to know why the Minister keeps standing me up.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much. I thank the member for the question, and I apologize that our schedules weren't able to mesh to be able to keep that engagement. However, Mr. Speaker, I did take the opportunity to go down and visit those intersections, and have had a look at them. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get you in my company, but we'll try and correct that the next time I'm in the area.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Tenants at Park Victoria in the south end of Halifax are experiencing infestations of ants, cockroaches, and bedbugs. The few sporadic attempts the landlord has made to get rid of the bedbugs have not been effective, and they have spread to 7 floors. I'm sure the Minister would agree that this is a public health concern, and tenants are frustrated that the landlord has failed again and again to do anything about it. My question for the Minister is, how is he working with other departments to make sure this public health issue is dealt with quickly and doesn't continue to occur?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The work of the Public Health Office and the Chief Medical Officer of Public Health does take place. I rely, Mr. Speaker, extensively on the recommendations and the input provided by the Chief Medical Officer through Public Health. The inspector staff for the Public Health Division, though, is actually part of the Department of Environment now. There was a change that was made back in 2015. So any work that will be done from an inspection and an assessment of situations, as the member would have described, would actually take place by employees within the Department of Health and the Department of Environment.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my follow-up is for the Minister of Service Nova Scotia. Even though Park Victoria fails again and again to deal with the infestation, its tenants are still paying the same high rent. And at least one tenant has even had their rent increased during the infestation. Some tenants have tried to move out, but there are not many places they can afford to go in Halifax's rental market. So my question is, does the Minister acknowledge that if Nova Scotia had rent control like other provinces, big landlords wouldn't be able to demand increasing rents for decreasing quality?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And certainly with respect to residential tenancies, the Act, the role that Service Nova Scotia has in really brokering relationships and keeping the communications open between tenants and landlords. We talk about a lot of issues, and many of the issues around the state of facilities, of the units that are rented, and all of the things that go along with that relationship between the tenant and the landlord. But, Mr. Speaker, rent control is not something that's come up in the consultations. We have had numerous with respect to this act that we have here before the House now, and all the conversations that we've had over the last year since I've been here. Rent control is not an issue that either side is focused on, and I don't think that's the solution here. But we'll continue to work together, and things like this particular example, these things are unacceptable. So if we have a role to play, we'll certainly do that. Thanks.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like so many of our healthcare facilities, the Strait Richmond Hospital is greatly in need of renovations to modernize the facility. The hospital was built in the early 1980s, and because of its age, it doesn't have accessible washrooms, nor does it have washrooms anywhere in the emergency department. Literally, patients are having to use like a commode if they can't get to the washroom. Patients visiting a surgeon have to first walk through the emergency department, and while donors and the NSHA are committed to providing some money, it's going to be up to the hospital foundation foundation to find the balance of the $2.3 million for the renovations. Does the minister think it's fair to ask the foundation to fundraise that much money for badly needed renovations?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Indeed, we work with our partners, the Nova Scotia Health Authority and the IWK, to bring forward their prioritized investments for infrastructure and equipment. Mr. Speaker, both in my former role as a finance minister and subsequently now as health minister, have met with representatives of hospital foundations throughout the province. They made a number of requests about the approach that we take as a government when it comes to working on capital campaigns and expectations, how we roll out in partnership with these organizations, capital fundraising. We've made several changes in the last year in line with what we've been asked to do.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, the Strait Richmond Hospital, I'm going to give you some stats. Registrations last year were 28,264, inpatient admissions 609, and when the ER was open, which it wasn't a lot of the time, we had 9,577 emergency admissions. This is an important hospital to our area. The catchment area is not only Cape Breton-Richmond, it's Inverness, it's Guysborough, and it's also actually within the Health Minister's district of Antigonish. I get phone calls from that area as well about how important this hospital is. The private, we have a private donation of $300,000. The hospital foundation is willing to put in $300,000 as well. What is the minister willing to put into a $2.3 million to renovate the Strait Richmond Hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I'm sure the member can appreciate, hospital infrastructure, our healthcare infrastructure throughout the province is very important to all communities, Mr. Speaker. The investments and the sequence of the investments into new infrastructure projects and equipment, we do rely on the health authorities, the IWK and the Nova Scotia Health Authority to bring forward their recommendations and requests for investments, Mr. Speaker. That's how we prioritize. We then move forward with our budget to invest in those projects that we can, and we'll continue to knock projects off that list as we move forward.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Transportation. It's a subject that I've raised in this House through a number of different ministers. The interchange at exit 32 on Highway 103 in Argyle Head. Back in 2016, the good former minister said the intersection mattered and was seen as a priority by the district director. And I'll include the conversation that I had with the minister at that time in debate. And as we sit today, there's been no work done at exit 32, even after 2 years of acknowledging that it was a dangerous intersection that needed work. So my question to the Minister of Transportation, if this intersection was a priority 2 years ago, why hasn't it been improved?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question and for bringing this to my attention. All areas of the province where we have significant traffic implications which involve safety are of great interest to the department. I'll check and see for the member just exactly where that one is at.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
So, Mr. Speaker, you know, we started a long time ago trying to identify the dangerous intersections on the 103 and, of course, in other highways across this province. The exit 32 in Argyle Head, Glenwood, was identified as the top third most dangerous intersection in Nova Scotia, and we acknowledge that. We acknowledge there's problems there. The former minister acknowledged that there were concerns for long-term safety, and I thank the minister for looking at it when he drove by a number of times. The people are looking for a solution. Will the minister please advise the House, or please tell the House, the cost of the short and medium-term fixes, and just let us know when the work can begin?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for the question. On the 103, we're doing significant work, as the members are aware, the province is aware, on our twinning aspirations, and we are moving forward with some of the most dangerous pieces of our highway. we don't have this particular intersection as part of that program, but I will undertake to see where it lies in terms of priorities. Thank you.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Question for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, recently there was question about whether this government was moving away from universal dental coverage for children to only provide the service to those whose families meet an income test, which would seem compassionate. Now, I know this work isn't always the most profitable for dentists, as private dental plans pay more for the work than the government rates, and restless children in the chair sometimes take more time. But think of the money we save in fewer dental surgeries for children whose cavities land them in the emergency room because they have not gotten dental care. The change had been sold based on the idea that dental care was not reaching those most in need. Can the minister confirm whether government made the changes and table a report on emergency dental surgeries for children to see if these statistics are improving?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We haven't made changes to require income testing, Mr. Speaker. What we have done is move forward with increasing the coverage for some services for children. I think relating to not the fillings, but the some fluoride treatments and a couple of other treatments, Mr. Speaker. So in the last round of agreement that we entered into with the Dental Association, that is the moves that we made.
The honourable member for Inverness.
I'd like to thank the minister for that response, and I do accept his response. I do want to table for the members of the House benefit a news report that referred to a 2015 report. That and I think there was some movement within the department on that matter, but I take the minister's word here today as the current state of affairs. Universal dental care is comparable to universal health care. Who in this legislature would argue against the value of that? Many in health care would suggest that dental care is just as important, and we know that dental issues quickly become broader health problems for those that have them. Can the minister table evidence that this government has been able to increase the number of children getting the dental care that they need, because this has been a problem that does need to improve?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last time I gathered some information and was being briefed on the topic, I think one of the things that seemed a little bit challenging was actually awareness, Mr. Speaker, in some areas of the population. So I think it's important for members here to let their communities know that, in fact, there are services for youth to receive dental care. There have been some examples where individuals have come in too late, a little bit older, and some of the decay was greater, requiring surgery, where had they perhaps been seen earlier, it may not have been the case. And at times that those individuals coming into the dentist's office hadn't realized that they could have gotten some preventative care earlier. So again, I encourage all members to let their constituents know that this is a service that is available.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Lands and Forestry. While the minister sits on the Leahy report, irresponsible cuts are still happening in Crown forests. The most recent proposed cut of note is in Queens County, where there will likely be two-stage clear cuts just adjacent to the border of the Dunraven Bog, which is a wetland of international significance according to the UN. Mr. Speaker, forests take a very long time to grow and very little time to cut down. So my question for the minister is, if he's so committed to ecological forestry, why can't the department shift practices now before more damage is done?
The Honourable Minister of Lands and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in that proposed harvest plan, there is a combination of some partial cuts and some clear cuts, as I said, and actually the Leahy report also says that in certain circumstances, clear cuts are the appropriate treatment after looking at the soil conditions and the vegetation types and the site conditions on the ground. Also has positive comments on our forest ecological classification system. But of course, we look forward to looking at the report in earnest and looking at the different science-based systems within the report and looking at the technical papers and the appendices and ensuring that we're incorporating all of those things to ensure that we're obviously looking at managing our forests to promote those mixed species multi-age. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, this hardly seems like an appropriate location for plantation forestry on Crown land. The proposed cut poses real risks to the ecosystem, including depletion of already low soil nutrients, more soil acidification that will result in slower regeneration. And the cuts will also disrupt the connectivity of wildlife habitat, including for the mainland moose. The Leahy report clearly identified that the department should not allow clear cuts adjacent to lands like these. And it also found that the department's policies don't pay adequate attention to wildlife or soil quality. The proposed Queens County cut is another example of why we can't afford to delay changing our practices. So my question for the minister is, when will cuts like these be stopped?
The Honourable Minister of Lands and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And our integrated resource management team, which includes biologists, continue to look at the pre-treatment assessments proposed. These are proposed cuts, and to my knowledge, they don't abut against the protected land areas. The report did mention areas around where we can have setbacks around protected areas. So we're fully engaged in that process, talking with our Crown license holders. But we also want to acknowledge that this timber will go to support sawmills across the province. It's an important industry and continues to be. It's a $2 billion industry for this province, for this government, and this party is committed to find that balance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Based on the number of stories I've received from concerned constituents, it is clear that the government's response to ambulance wait times is not satisfying to Nova Scotians. A constituent from Queens informed me that it took an ambulance a little over an hour to arrive at her home while her son suffered in excruciating pain. The union representing paramedics knows this is unacceptable and wants the minister to host a healthcare summit to address offloading issues at Nova Scotia emergency departments. My question to the minister is, if this is a reasonable government, will he commit to hosting an event? A simple yes or no.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is an area that I've acknowledged needs work to be done. It's work that has begun in this area. Mr. Speaker, there's been a review initiated about EHS services, as well as a program that was implemented about 10 months ago at Dartmouth General. The evaluation of that initiative is being conducted so that we can see the results tangibly, which we anecdotally are aware of. I've heard from paramedics, nurses. I've been to the site, Mr. Speaker. I've heard from healthcare professionals at other sites, Mr. Speaker, who are aware of the positive impacts at Dartmouth General. So we are taking it very seriously and looking at ways to improve the offload of our ambulance services.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, it's great that the minister has listened to paramedics, but it's not enough to hear about it. It's time for him to live it. Experience going to a call and arriving after an hour that the person has called. Experience sitting for hours in hallways of emergency departments waiting to offload your patient. Experience the frustrations that our hardworking paramedics have to go through each and every day. My colleague tabled a letter from the union representing Nova Scotia paramedics affirming the need for the minister to not just talk the talk, but also walk the walk. Mr. Speaker, in keeping with the spirit of the day, talking about walks on the beach and invitations, will the minister take a drive with me to Queens, sign a confidentiality agreement, and join the hard-working paramedics at Queens Base for a full 12-hour shift?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've previously noted, I did spend an afternoon, Mr. Speaker, in an ambulance facility that took me out, Mr. Speaker, to while we're waiting for calls, Mr. Speaker. It did happen to be a day where the call volume was lower than average. I believe an indication that they were getting an average of about 600 calls. At that time, we were at about 400 calls on the day, so it was a slower day. But it was, Mr. Speaker, I guess the advantage of that was when we went into the hospital, there were a couple of paramedics with patients waiting. Gave the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, where we were able to actually have a detailed conversation to hear about their experience, both at that time and other experiences. It's where I was first heard directly from frontline people about the changes that were taking place at Dartmouth General and the benefit of those changes.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Health. There is a shortage of family doctors in Nova Scotia, but international medical graduates, IMGs, struggle to find opportunities to get licensed here. That's a hard pill to swallow for IMGs who have to wait patiently for residency spots while hearing about the 100,000 Nova Scotians without a family doctor. There are many Nova Scotians who went abroad to attend medical school at no expense to the province and want to come home and work closely with their friends and family. So my question to the minister is, how many international graduates who are Nova Scotian born and raised are presently doing a residency here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure what the exact number is, but I'll certainly put the inquiry in and provide it to the member. What I can say, though, Mr. Speaker, is that Nova Scotia recognized those challenges, and they recognize the challenges of students who have graduated medical school looking for opportunities for residence. That's why Nova Scotia is the only province in this country who's expanded our residency positions, 10 seats in family medicine and 15 seats in specialty, Mr. Speaker. We are the progressive province in this country, looking to provide opportunities for medical graduates to complete their residency training.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to that information. And I could also recommend a good physiotherapist for the minister when he keeps on patting his own back. Mr. Speaker, this minister believes that if he builds it, doctors will be lining up to call Nova Scotia home. However, Doctors Nova Scotia is on record arguing that Nova Scotia's chronic physician crisis is primarily due to the poor compensation that is given to doctors in this province. With much fanfare, the Nova Scotia government announced 10 residency spaces for medical students. A good move, and I would say that. My question to the minister is this: with the 10 residency spaces just recently announced, how many of those will be available to international medical graduates, Nova Scotians, who want to come back home to provide care in the communities that they grew up in?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure I can answer the question fully in 45 seconds, but I'll do my best. Mr. Speaker, residency... Mr. Speaker,
please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
The residency positions that provinces make available, Mr. Speaker, are part of a national program. We add to the national pool, and it's that program, Mr. Speaker, that identifies and matches the medical student residents to the position. So in that sense, Mr. Speaker, we don't have dedicated residency based upon where people study. However, Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia students that are studying at Dalhousie Medical School through the medical program are mostly Nova Scotians. The other thing that's important to note, Mr. Speaker, is about 75% of all residents stay in the province where they train. That's information that was provided to us from MARDOCS, which is the Medical Residents Association here in Nova Scotia. Maritime, sorry, Residents Association.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Transportation. Recently, my constituency office received an email from a concerned citizen in Parisborough about the Parisborough-Abateau Bridge. I will table the photos that they sent in. The lake that once existed seemed to be disappearing. I think that's all. By looking at the pictures over time, it's obvious that the water levels have receded significantly. This is worrisome to the local residents. My question to the Minister of Transportation is his department responsible for the maintenance of this Abateau Bridge in Parisborough? And if so, when was the last inspection?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I appreciate that. The member brings up a significant matter that faces Nova Scotians. In the province, we have over 90 abattoirs, some of which date back over 100 years. They've been effective, simple solutions to tidal estuaries in the past, but of course, you know, after 100 years, a lot of things get to the end of their best before date. In this particular instance, this one has not been brought to my attention, but we'll take a look at it and see just what the circumstance is. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for the response. Just to update, repairs for this infrastructure are scheduled for 2022-23. Constituencies are concerned, as well as am I, that this may be too long for the boaters, swimmers, and the residents in the Parisboro area. The province has been struggling to keep up with the repairs of abatos all over, as we have heard in Hantsport and the Causeway in Windsor. I would like to invite the Minister to come visit at Cumberland South and see if we can expedite these repairs for this abato. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, and thank the member for the question, and appreciate the invitation. We'll make an effort to accommodate that. And in terms of whose ownership is on the abatos, they are a little bit different. In some instances, they are the responsibility of this department. In other instances, they were placed there for agricultural reasons, so we have a mixed arrangement there on them. It's a little bit of a quandary in terms of looking after the responsibility. However, it's our commitment to make sure that we meet the requirement of the residents in these areas and continue to have these as functional pieces of infrastructure in our communities. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. Between 2013 and 2017, the total number of child protection referrals across the province increased by almost 1,000. I can table that document. Between 2016 and 2017, applications to the Family Division of the Provincial Court under the Child and Family Services Act increased by 8%. I'll table that. Prior to changes brought in by this government, these numbers were on a downward trend. Mr. Speaker, can the minister explain why there has not been an adequate increase in the number of social workers in the department to correspond to this increase in need?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we have been able to move resources around, so then when we find out that there is a spike, and sometimes that happens in an area for one reason or another, that we can actually move social workers in, move managers in to assist in that. What I can tell the honourable member is the number of cases per social worker is well within national guidelines, but I would note that sometimes we have a caseworker who might have a series of complicated cases, and we do take that into account, Mr. Speaker, because sometimes 5 cases can be more work than 15. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, when children are taken into care, there are a number of placement options. These options include foster homes, residential care facilities, and places of safety. Places of safety are hotels or apartments where children are housed when other options are unavailable or inappropriate. Mr. Speaker, will the minister table for this House the number of children housed in hotel rooms over the past year?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I would note, Mr. Speaker, that we are in the process of looking at our continuum of care options for children who come into the care of the minister. It is clear to me that upon arriving at the department that this is an issue of some importance, and we expect to have information on this in the near future. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
My question, Mr. Speaker, is for the Minister of Transportation. Last year, I presented a petition of 300 signatures asking for a speed reduction in Centreville. The speed reduction was implemented everywhere in the community but the road directly in front of the Centreville Park. The stretch of road I'm referring to is Sherman-Belcher Road in the heart of the Kings County hamlet. Like any other park, Centreville Park is a destination for families and children and should have a safer speed limit. My question for the Minister is, will the Minister heed the petition and lower the speed limit in front of Centreville Park on Sherman-Belcher Road?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank Member Ops for the question. I'm beginning to feel like the Minister of Health today. I hear what the I hear what the member is saying, and on the issue of speeds and speed reduction and posted speeds, I can assure the House that there is a lot of science that goes into that. There's a standardized process across the province, and we are actually reviewing some of those at the present time, because we are getting a lot of requests from municipal units in particular to adjust speeds depending on traffic patterns that are there. So I will undertake to go back and take a look at that again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that you do now leave the chair and the House resolve itself into a committee of the whole House on bills.
The House will now resolve itself into the committee on the whole House on bills and will recess while we set up.
The Committee of the Whole House on Bills will come to order. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would you please call Bill number 29, the Labour Standards Code?
I call Bill number 29, the Labour Standards Code. The Clerk.
Madam Chair, Bill 29 has 18 clauses and was referred back from the Law Amendments Committee without amendments.
Shall Clause 1 carry? Shall Clause 2 carry? I recognize the Honourable Minister for Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have before the House here changed to page 1, clause 2. A, re-letter paragraphs A, B, D, and E. Add the following paragraphs. A, re-lettering clause BA as clause BAB. B, adding immediately after clause B the following clauses. BA, prescribe a period of employment of less than 1 year for the purpose of establishing entitlement to a pregnancy leave pursuant to Section 59. BAA, prescribe a period of employment of less than 1 year for the purpose of establishing entitlement to a pregnancy leave as required by an employer pursuant to Section 59A. And C, adding immediately after clause BAB the following clause. BAC, prescribe a period of employment of less than 1 year for the purpose of establishing entitlement to a parental leave pursuant to Section 59B. Madam Speaker, we heard at Law Amendments proposal come through for an amendment to shorten the period that parental leave recipients would have to wait for job protection from 1 year to a shorter period of time. Madam Speaker, the government is in favor of a shorter period of time. What we'd like to do is signal that we're going to go out and do some consultation. The bill dealt with expanding the time that the parental leave was. It did not look at the period of time you were eligible for parental leave or not eligible for it. So because it wasn't dealing with that part, and that was brought forward at Law Amendments, other people who might have wanted to speak on it did not have the opportunity. This is where our consultation comes into place. Madam Speaker, I would like to inform the House that the department has already started engaging in these consultations, and we anticipate that the changes will take place before Christmas. We are in favor of a shorter period of time. The question is, we want all stakeholders to have their input into what that shorter period of time should be. And I will also add that the changes will happen in regulation through an order in council, and that way we don't have to reconvene the House to come back in to pass one regulatory change. Thank you.
I recognize the Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You'll have to excuse me. We weren't expecting this bill to come today, and so I'm a little bit maybe slightly disorganized in my response. I will say with some restraint that I'm disappointed in the action that the government has taken here. This government, and in particular this Premier, has said several times in this House about his commitment to gender equity, his commitment to progressive values. And with respect, Madam Chair, this is an easy one. The Liberal federal government has introduced legislation extending both a longer period of maternity leave for those who are pregnant and bearing children, and additionally, a shorter period of job protection for, or eligibility rather, for people who take that leave. So in the federal legislation, which we have been told that this legislation mirrors, so we might want to pull out our dictionary when we look at the term mirror. In the federal legislation, the eligibility period to take this extended leave is 600 hours. 600 hours translates to roughly 15 to 17 weeks of work. Across Canada, women will be able to take a longer maternity leave after 15 to 17 weeks of work, but not in Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, women will have to have worked a full year before that leave is before their job is protected when they take that leave. They may still get the benefits of that leave, but they do not get the job protection. I am outraged, Madam Speaker, that the minister's approach to this is that he needs to consult. With whom does the minister need to consult to ensure that women get the same rights across the country as they do in Nova Scotia? Consult with business owners? I'm sorry, Madam Speaker, the business owners I know, and there are tons of them in my district, in general would like to extend the basic human I don't know if I want to say human rights because it doesn't quite fit in there, but it's something, in fact, about our collective humanity. It's progress as a culture that we are finally recognizing that children need the attention of parents, that parents need the ability to spend time with their children, to nurture their children, to be able to have a longer period where children have the ability to form attachment and form bonds, to do better in life. We've heard the Minister of Education say in this House time and time again, we want to increase the outcomes for children. We want to make sure that children at risk have the best chance in life. He's introduced pre-primary. We had a bunch of trouble with it, but we have a universal program, the beginnings of a universal program in early childhood education. Madam Speaker, this is a step backwards, and we will introduce an amendment after this is done, and I would beseech the government to considering our amendment to do what they have said they would do and to mirror the federal legislation. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Shall Clause 2 carry? Well, shall the amendment carry? It is carried. Shall Clause 2 carry? Shall Clauses 3 to 7 carry? Shall Clause 8 carry? I recognize the Minister for Labour and Advanced Education.
Madam Chair, I would like to, for Clause 8, delete and substitute the following. 1. Subsection 59(1) of Chapter 246, as enacted by Chapter 14 of the Acts of 1991, is amended by A, adding or such shorter period as may be prescribed by the regulations immediately after year in the third line, and B, striking out 17 in the fourth line and substituting 16. So, Madam Chair, to explain this area, these 16 weeks from 17 weeks mirrors that the federal government for EI eligibility has reduced the waiting time from 2 to 1 week. So this way the EI lines up with the reduction in how long a person has to wait before they can start collecting EI. Madam Speaker, I will give the member from Dartmouth South the benefit of the doubt because, as she said, she was not fully prepared for this bill, but I would like to address her comments, and hopefully after my address she'll feel a bit more comfortable. A correction in terms of the 600 hours she is speaking about for eligibility. 600 hours of eligibility is to receive EI benefits. It has nothing to do as a federal employee when you can take your mat leave. The federal guidelines are 6 months. So there are two different aspects. So, Madam Speaker, just for clarification, you are eligible for EI after you have 600 accumulated hours, and you can collect EI for eligibility of going on mat leave and being paid the EI amount. But every province and the federal government have different prescribed amounts of when you can actually have job protections when you leave from your work. In Nova Scotia, it's 1 year. We agree it should be a lower period of time. We're open to that, and that's what we're going to go out and consult on. But for the federal government, it is not 600 hours. That's EI. The federal government is actually at 6 months. And the reason I know this is because my wife works for the federal government, and she's actually on a maternity leave right now. Madam Speaker, I will add the federal government changes, and this is why I was so excited to bring this forward. It allows mothers and fathers to have, and other parents to have 18 months instead of 1 year. A 1-year-old child, you know, you might not want them to go to someone else to care for them. They're not walking, they're not talking, they can't communicate what's happening to them when they're away from the parents. 18 months, the child is a little more mature. What we brought forward is a bill to actually give the 18-month leave. I will say that at law amendments, a good idea came forward, and in that good idea, it was, well, why have parents wait a year to be eligible for job protection to take a leave? Let's look at a different period of time. I completely 100% agree with that. But what is the period of time? There's some provinces that are at 16, 17 weeks. Other provinces are at 6 months. Others are at a different period of time. Federal government's at 6 months. All I'm saying is I'm not going to abuse my power by arbitrarily picking a date because what I want to do is give Nova Scotians the ability to come forward and speak to us. As I stated earlier, we have already begun these consultations. We have reached out to our unions, to our business groups to actually start talking to them. I directed the department, and they have begun reaching out today, Madam Speaker. In terms of that, we also, you know, the member from Dartmouth South has said that our government is not doing enough for you know, women's rights. I completely disagree. Our government actually brought gender parity to the courts of Nova Scotia. Madam Speaker, it was also mentioned about pre-primary. Well, one of the arguments that the NDP had against us is we didn't consult enough on pre-primary. So that is why we want to go out and consult, Madam Speaker.
I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The government has become fond of pointing out to the opposition when they're not listening, so I'll do the same here. For the minister's benefit, what I said was that the government had passed several progressive pieces of legislation, and I included pre-primary among that. I said that this was an anomaly and that this is not a progressive piece of legislation. With respect, what the federal government time span is somewhat, I mean, it's useful, but not germane particularly to this conversation. The point is, if it takes 17 weeks to be eligible, then that is the same amount of time we are arguing that you should take off in order to have job protection, because job protection is key. This is where women fall out of the workforce. They fall out of the workforce when they leave to raise their children because the cost of childcare is too high, because it doesn't make sense to work. I've said this in prior debates on pre-primary, but the number of times I've been asked whether I can afford to go back to work is so unbelievably insulting, I can't even tell you. Because why is it I who should have to figure out whether I can afford to go back to work? Why isn't it my husband's salary? It isn't. It's my salary. It's, can you afford to go back to work? Maybe it makes more sense financially for you to stay home. Women should not have to deal with that question. Period. And there's an ability right now for the government to make a decision to lower that barrier so significantly for women, to ensure that they don't have to make that decision. And with respect, for the minister to say that this is an abuse of his power, please. The minister just told us that it would be an abuse of his power to say that the eligibility period was 17 weeks. And I'm sorry, but that's just a little rich. This government, to put it kindly, is decisive. This government makes decisions. This government makes decisions that are popular and makes decisions that are unpopular, and does it somewhat with impunity. So I'm asking all of you to do the same right now. Make a decision. It's not an abuse of power. In fact, as a minister, it's your responsibility, and I'm asking you to take it. Thank you.
Does the amendment carry? Carried. The amendment is carried. Does the clause carry? Carried. Oh, I recognize the member for Dartmouth South.
I draw the member's attention to CWHB Gov-1, CWHB NDP-1, page 2, subclause 8, sub 1, line 2. I'll read our proposed amendment and then I'll speak to it, although I'm pretty sure by now everyone knows what's coming. Add striking out 1 year immediately after by in the second and third lines and substituting 17 weeks and. So essentially what we're doing here is we're lining up the period of EI eligibility, which is 17 weeks for everyone, with the amount of time that you have to have worked prior to taking that leave to be eligible for job protection.
We'll take a short recess to confer with Ledge Council. Order. I call this meeting of the whole House Committee on Bills to order. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that you do now rise and report progress on this bill.
The motion is carried. The committee will now rise and report its business to the House.
Order, please. The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on Bills will now report.
That the Committee of the Whole House on Bills has met and made some progress on Bill number 29 and begs leave to sit again.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call public bills for second reading?
We'll now call public bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 67, the Securities Act?
We'll now call Bill number 67, the Securities Act. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move Bill 67, amendments to the Securities Act, be now read a second time. Bill 67 will harmonize Nova Scotian securities regulations with other Canadian jurisdictions, in keeping with our commitment as part of the Council of Ministers, and promote the improved enforcement of securities laws across Canada. The Nova Scotia Securities Commission exists to provide investors with protection from activities that undermine investor confidence in Nova Scotia capital markets. The Securities Commission protects investors through education, compliance, registration, and enforcement of Nova Scotian securities laws. These amendments will do a number of things. Number one, they will enhance enforcement of securities regulations by extending certain powers of the Nova Scotia Securities Commission to the recognized self-regulatory organizations that it oversees. Such organizations would include the Investment Industry Regulations Organization of Canada and the Mutual Fund Dealers Association of Canada. These enhancements will provide these organizations with the power to file administrative orders with the court, enabling the collection of fines and costs as if they were civil judgments, compel evidence from witnesses during an investigation and during a hearing, and provide statutory immunity to the self-regulating organization's staff, directors, officers, and agents. Mr. Speaker, these amendments will make the work of these self-regulatory organizations more efficient and the process less cumbersome. Second, we are also repealing the section of the Act that requires the Attorney General's consent to initiate quasi-criminal proceedings. With these changes, that decision will be made by the Securities Commission. Currently, these types of proceedings are very infrequent, seeing only one every few years. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, the amendments will also add provisions to establish the regulatory financial benchmarks which will be adopted by all Canadian Securities Association jurisdictions. Provisions will be added to enhance Community Economic Development Corporation regulations, allowing the Securities Commission the ability to administer these regulations and make amendments as required. Additional provisions will also extend existing immunity for employees of the Commission from being called as a witness in private civil proceedings or being required to produce documents and written evidence obtained from their duties at the Commission. This will prevent paid staff time being taken up with participation as a witness in a private civil dispute that does not have a public interest aspect. Mr. Speaker, we are making these changes to align with the securities regulations established in other provinces. To date, amendments extending enforcement powers to self-regulatory organizations have been made across Canada. Consultation between the Commission and its regulatory counterparts in other jurisdictions have confirmed that Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut have already extended those enforcement powers. Both Ontario and Prince Edward Island have made similar amendments which will give more power to those self-regulating organizations. Mr. Speaker, most other provinces currently have similar provisions like the one we're making to extend immunity to employees of the Securities Commission. The proposed amendments to the Securities Act will improve standards and efficiencies and ensure that Nova Scotia remains consistent with other Canadian provinces. These amendments are designed to provide the best possible protection for investors in Nova Scotia. The proposed amendments to the Securities Act will improve standards and efficiencies and, again, keep us consistent with other jurisdictions across Canada. Mr. Speaker, I close debate on, no I don't. I await the comments from my other members.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Speaker and Minister of Finance, thank you for the opportunity. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of security laws, I believe at heart, are ultimately for the consumer. But they are also for the industry itself. They are there to protect the integrity of the industry. If people were investing and there were no rules and people were getting hurt, they would stop investing. I also believe that with self-regulation, we are allowing influential industry players to create rules to control the revenue streams. Now, it may be a bit controversial for me to say that, but Mr. Speaker, I think there is an interest by the industry to control revenue streams, and who could blame them? People want to make money. And I offer for you as proof mutual fund fees in this country. We have some of the highest mutual fund fees in the world. And I believe that is proof enough that the industry, with self-regulation, has an ability to control the revenue streams. And whether that's for people who are belonging to the MFDA or for and they keep changing the name of the other organization that would be representative people working who are advisors who are selling stocks, bonds, and other instruments directly to consumers. Mr. Speaker, the reason I'm raising this is because I believe a lot of the revenue earned by Nova Scotians working in this industry finds its way to Bay Street in Toronto. And that's just the reality of it. I believe some Maritimers do benefit, but most do not. And if we look at the pension consultation in the province a few short years ago, I remember going through the report. It was before I was elected, and I remember reading about something called Safe Harbour. Now, Safe Harbour, the whole purpose of it is to allow, for a lot of people now, we don't see defined benefit pension plans anymore, where you put money in, you're guaranteed to get a certain amount back, much like the government pension plan as an example. Most people out there have a defined contribution plan. So the money they put in, what comes out at the other end when they retire depends heavily upon how it's invested and the circumstances in which it's invested. So the idea behind a safe harbor would allow advisors to give people who belong to a defined contribution plan, let's say university professors is one example, to give those professors advice on not only what investments they could choose, but also advice along broader financial planning issues that have proven statistically sometimes to make more of a difference in terms of what they retire with, in terms of their pension and their savings. So the purpose of Safe Harbor would be to protect the university, their employer, from any liability associated with the advisors helping them with their defined contribution plan. So, Mr. Speaker, that has been proven to be more effective than the, I will call them robots, or computer software that is used by a lot of the big players in the industry who don't want money going to advisors, like individual advisors here in Nova Scotia, but prefer that money to flow through the computer software, which would help those professors choose investments, and that's it, no other advice, it would flow those revenues. The fees are nice and low, Mr. Speaker, but the reason the fees for advisors are high is because those same companies that want the fees going through the computer software are clipping a high percentage of the fees that individual advisors charge. And those advisors are Nova Scotians. They're people who are small business owners, and I want to put that on the record. So when we look at the pension consultation from a few years ago, it doesn't surprise me that some people who have ties to the industry, who have been very successful in the industry, and who hold shares in the big firms of the country, many, many shares. I'm not talking about somebody that owns 200 shares in TD Bank. I'm talking about somebody who may be a director at TD Bank, or somebody who might have thousands of shares of one of the big banks, investment firms. So, and I heard a member say, not me. Well, that's true, and most of us don't. Most Nova Scotians don't. So most Nova Scotians may have a different opinion than those people. But yet it was that opinion that was carried forward in the pension consultation in the result of the report. So, Mr. Speaker, I've raised it with the minister before in budget estimates. I just raised it to put it on her radar, just so that we don't think when we hear maybe a couple of people who we may consider to be in the know in Nova Scotia, to think that they're looking after our interests, or perhaps all the independent advisors out there, or perhaps in the case I've just made, for the investor, which is the most important person that we should be thinking about here in this legislature. But I also think we should be thinking about the independent business owners, the advisors out there. So, Mr. Speaker, I think I've covered that part. So I think I've made the case, Mr. Speaker, that there's opportunity and it may be a little bit separate of this bill, but I want to put it on the record as part of general discussion. There's potential to create more employment for Nova Scotians, because we need more of them. If we're not using computer software to advise people on their defined contribution plans, we need Nova Scotians to do that instead. I think I've covered all this by heart. I'm looking at my notes, but I've pretty well covered it. So I want to say, Mr. Speaker, I'm not against the harmonization of securities regulators, but I cannot help but feel there's an opportunity lost. As we move more towards harmonization, it consolidates more of the control into the hands of the industry, which I don't believe is always acting in the best interests of consumers, and not always in the best interest of the people working for their firms, because they are more interested in ensuring they're clipping the maximum amount of revenue they can from the people that are working for them. And that's just business, Mr. Speaker. I don't criticize them even for doing that, but I, as somebody standing in this legislature who knows better, feel it's my duty to state that and to make that known for people who may not be aware of that. So, Mr. Speaker, I do think we could be creating an industry here in Nova Scotia where more of these investment fee revenues stay in our province instead of landing in the pockets of people on Bay Street. I believe more Nova Scotians, as advisors, could be offering advice monitored by more Nova Scotians working at our securities regulator, giving Nova Scotian investors more tailored financial advice, which has been proven to improve their financial health in retirement. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and glad to see or have a few moments to speak on Bill 67, the Securities Act. We know here in Nova Scotia it's important to make sure that our regulations that oversee the Nova Scotia Security Commission are updated as needed, but more importantly are aligned with some of the other jurisdictions and changes we've seen in neighbouring provinces across the country, Mr. Speaker. It's important, I think, even though we're a smaller province in Canada, that the the efforts of the Security Commission here in Nova Scotia are met with strong legislation that supports their work and the work that they do. And I think the Minister outlined a little bit of reasons why the changes are needed to make sure that those who do work within the Security Commission do what Nova Scotians need them to do, and that's to monitor the field itself, Mr. Speaker. We know in the past there's been some very high-profile cases of mismanagement, corruption, illegal activity when it comes to investors. Enron is the one that kind of stands out the most, and others that we've seen many people lose their whole wealth, Mr. Speaker, because of their actions. And we need to make sure here in Nova Scotia that we are keeping up with what the trends are across the country and around the globe to make sure that Nova Scotia Security Commission can do their job appropriately. Many Nova Scotians who might not think that, why bother even paying attention to the Security Act that we have or the Security Commission, because they may not physically or directly invest in bonds or the market itself. But as my colleague just mentioned, Mr. Speaker, many pension plans, if they're not the defined pension plans, which we're seeing less and less of in Nova Scotia, are driven by the market and driven by those investments being made. And we want to make sure that those companies, those organizations that are doing that on behalf of the pension plans of Nova Scotians and Canadians, for that matter, are doing it in a way that meets all the requirements, the laws that we set out. And we hear those heartbreaking cases time and time again of pension plans that are having to be clawed back after someone has retired because the company, for example, has gone bankrupt or closed down. I think of Sears, for example, more recently. And that may be other issues, but it just shows how important it is to make sure that the Security Commission here can do the work, has the legislation behind them, to make sure that people, organizations, and businesses are acting appropriately when they're dealing with such things like pension funds for Nova Scotians. So we look forward to this moving forward. It is sometimes a bit complex and hard to understand exactly what's going on, but I think we all look for support and help and guidance sometimes, and we'll continue to do that through this process. And we'll be interested to see if anybody does have concerns or issues brought forward at law amendments, and we'll move from there. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Finance to be to close second reading of Bill number 67, the Securities Act. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleagues on the other side who have brought some very important concerns to the floor of the legislature here. In particular, the comment was made about the purpose of securities laws, and it is not only well, I guess there's really four. There's the industry, there's the investors, there's the independent advisors, and there's the consumers. All need protection from any kind of legislation that we have. I believe we have that protection within the Securities Act. However, there are some areas that needed to be amended to perhaps further enforce those bits of protection and security. So I appreciate the attention that the member in particular from Inverness has brought to the floor of the House, and also to the member from Sackville-Cobequid, who is made a very good point that Nova Scotians in general probably pay little attention to this. However, directly or indirectly, it will now or it will in the future have an impact on them. So I think we, although it may be seen to be not too exciting piece of legislation, it does have and the potential to have a great impact. So I want to thank the members who spoke for their words and their acknowledgement that there is a need to make some amendments to keep us in line with the harmonization across Canada, and and I do look forward to law amendments. And with those few comments, I will close debate on second reading of Bill 67.
Motion is for second reading of Bill number 67, the Securities Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 67, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 418 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Securities Act.
Ordered that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That concludes the government's business for today. I move that the House do now rise to meet again Tuesday, October 2nd, between the hours of 1 p.m. and 6 p.m. Following daily routine and QP, business will include Committee of the Whole House on bills to consider Bill 29, as well as third readings on bills 27, 32, 38, 42, 44, 45, and 48. And I would also note that law amendments, the Committee on Law Amendments will meet Monday, October 1st at 3 p.m.
Motion is for the House to adjourn to rise again Tuesday, October the 2nd, between the hours of 1 p.m. and 6 p.m. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The House now stands adjourned until Tuesday, October 2nd at 1 p.m.